Welcome all. Thank you so much for coming along to the Enhancing Decision Making and Supporting Informal Relationships for Better Outcomes for Care Experienced Young People today. Really excited to be here. My name is Pearl Goodman-Burns and I'm the Program Manager of Raising Expectations, which is a program run by the Centre aimed at increasing participation of care experienced young people in tertiary education. This session is quite close to my heart, as I can see it is to you too, with over 260 people registered to attend what is going to be a very informative and enlightening event. Before we get going, I'd like to start by acknowledging land. I'm coming to you from the lands of the Wadawurrung people, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'd like to also acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So first, a little bit of housekeeping as always. If you can just take this moment to mute yourself if you're not already, the mute button is in the left-hand corner of your screen. That would be wonderful, just so we can hear the speakers perfectly. Can you also ensure that your Zoom name is your own? This will make it easier when it comes to questions and answers a bit later on. The event organisers and myself will be keeping our cameras on, but feel free to use your video or not, whatever suits you best. Just a reminder to use the chat. So we'd love for you to put any thoughts, questions and comments into the chat as we progress, because we will have a little bit of time for questions to our presenters at the end. If you do have any tech issues, because we've all been there, first try leaving the session and then rejoining, as this most often sorts the issues out. If that's not working for you, you can private message Sarah Ryan by choosing Sarah Ryan in the chat function. Just so you know, we'll be recording this session so we can share it with those that couldn't make it after the event. So this session is due to conclude at 1:45, but for those who wish to stay on for an additional 15 minutes, we have our wonderful senior editor of the Centre's recently relaunched journal, Children Australia. And so Melissa will be joining us at the end to provide a tour of the website and more information on that wonderful journal. So we have a fantastic session planned today focused on empowering young people in care and those that are transitioning from care. We have Dr Jacinta Waugh joining us, who's recently completed her PhD, sharing what her research says on the importance of informal relationships for young people transitioning from care. Jacinta has presented her research at a number of local and international conferences and has recently had a chapter published in a book on new and innovative research. Congratulations, Jacinta. Firstly, though, I'd like to welcome Lottie Harris. Lottie's presentation title is Discussion Starter on Participatory Practices for Children and Young People in Out-of-Home Care. Lottie is undertaking her PhD as part of the Australian Child Maltreatment Study, which is the first Australian study of the prevalence of child maltreatment. Lottie's research focus is on the health impacts of child multi-type maltreatment and the subsequent best practice assessments and interventions for children and young people in out-of-home care. This research is expanding on Lottie's professional experience in child welfare, which includes policy, research, and direct practice in the homelessness and out-of-home care sectors within New South Wales. So over to you, Lottie. Thank you.
Thanks, Pearl. Just checking that you can all see the presentation there.
We can.
Thanks, Pearl. Cheers. Okay. Thanks, everyone, for being here. I'll begin my presentation by acknowledging the Tabaga people of the Wiradjuri Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm coming from today. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people here today. In light of the topic that we're discussing today, I'd briefly like to also acknowledge the past and current systemic wrongdoings of the child protection and out-of-home care systems across this country that have led to a massive overrepresentation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and families within these systems. I always try to hold this in mind in my own practice and balance the need to be Aboriginal-led in certain circumstances and taking responsibility myself to support community who shouldn't have to manage these issues alone. So thanks, Pearl, for introducing me. I just wanted to say a few things before we get into it as well. I've been really fortunate enough to have experience in both practice and research in out-of-home care. I started my career as a youth worker in residential houses and with children, young people transitioning to independence. And then I did all sorts of things, case manager, team leader. I ended up as a program manager of a program, out-of-home care program in Sydney. Now I'm even as fortunate to be doing a PhD program aimed at improving health systems for kids in care. I'm under the fantastic guidance of Professor Daryl Higgins and Dr. Megan Willis at ACU. And also, just as an aside, I started the process last week with my partner to become approved foster carers. So I say all this just to say that I am totally dedicated and invested in this sector. I strongly believe that we have an ethical responsibility to provide the best care to these kids as possible, and I'm certain that everyone here thinks the same. So I'm going to be presenting on a project that was led by the Centre for Excellence in Child and Family Welfare, and hopefully the findings are of interest and applicable to all of you here today. We really encourage during this presentation the sharing of practice and ideas. Sometimes out-of-home care can be a bit siloed. You can be in your own organisation and not hear about what else goes on, but the centre offers a really fantastic opportunity in this presentation to share. So please use that chat function. We'd love to hear some innovative practice. That's what it's all about. The last thing I'll say on this slide is that there's a huge amount to talk on this topic. I will try and stick to my time limits. There'll be things on slides that I don't get to, but they'll be available to you afterwards. And if you have any questions or just, ask in chat or chat to me later, love to talk to you. So why are we talking about this topic today? There's a load of reasons. One being that the sector has moved on, thankfully, beyond children as passive recipients of services. And there's a lot of interest and work being done to implement strategies that include the voice of clients at the moment. We're hearing a lot from services that want support to do this successfully and meaningfully. And although there is a lot of momentum in this area, the out-of-home care space involves unique challenges to meaningfully engaging clients, namely because it's not a voluntary service offering, and also because it's highly legislated, and both these things leave little room for involving children and young people meaningfully. And also, another reason why we're talking about this today is that we are the adults in these children's lives, and we have a responsibility to ensure that we uphold their inherent rights to engage with, and have a say on matters that affect them. So that's why we're here. I'd like to briefly just share a bit about our project and about how we came to the findings that we're going to talk to. The project came about because, as I just mentioned, although there's a lot of interest in this area and appetite for supporting youth participation, there's also a fair amount of caution and confusion about how to do it effectively within the out-of-home care system. And for this project and for this presentation, when I say out-of-home care, I'm talking about all placement types, resi, kin, alternate care, foster care, whatever, any age groups, any young people. We included everyone in this project. Our task was to explore what the research said about how to authentically make participation work for children and young people, so that we could deliver a product to you all, to the sector, about that overviews useful practices that you can implement in your day-to-day practice. It was also important for us to validate this evidence with what we found from the literature. What we found in the literature with real-life practitioner experiences. So we interviewed a number of providers across Victoria on what we'd found. The majority agreed that the suggestions for practice that were in the literature were either things that they were already doing to varying degrees, or things that they agreed they would like to do but couldn't for various reasons. There were challenges to it. We found very little in the research that was not also endorsed by practitioners, which is a great sign. Now, also bear in mind with this project, it was only short. It's a 3-month project. It wasn't an exhaustive kind of research project. And that obviously comes with some limitations. One that I would just briefly like to mention today is that this project was not specifically Aboriginal led. And therefore, I'm not going to be speaking and not in a place to discuss Aboriginal best practices in this space. However, I will mention that a few came up in our research and we'll be talking to those. And that this is an area where Aboriginal-led organisations and peak bodies do amazing work, and they're the guideposts for your work with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and families, really. And so please share resources in the chat, and that would be great. Generally, what we're here to discuss today was the evidence that was generalizable to all children and young people, but of course, consideration should be for cultural adaptations to any of the practices we mentioned, depending on the needs of the children and families that you're working with. So in thinking ahead of this presentation, I was kind of thinking, what do practitioners and people that might be here today want from this topic? And I suspect quite a bit of it is about knowledge sharing, taking home some ideas, trying some new ideas. This is a space that is innovative. We're trying things, being creative. But I also think today, and I hope today, that we can offer you some hope as well. I know personally that working in out of home care, you do not see change quickly. It can take years and years. And this can lead you to wondering whether you're actually making any difference or whether you're doing the things you're doing, whether they're right or not. And this, yeah, you can lead to burnout. So thinking so much about feeling lucky today that we can give you some assurances and hope that this stuff really works, even if you don't see it working. That's the point of evidence-informed practice, I guess. So whether you're already doing everything that we mentioned today or a few things, or if you're about to start some new practices, hopefully we can give you some confidence that this stuff is evidence-based and it's worth persisting with. So shall we get on to some findings? Something we have to acknowledge right at the beginning, and something that came through in our research a lot, was that children benefit greatly from being included in decision making. And now I know that this is not new for anyone, I'm sure, but when children and young people in out of home care specifically participate in decision making, evidence has shown that their sense of belonging, self worth, confidence, even sense of self advocacy can be improved. And also, there are organisational benefits as well. So, when children and young people are included in decision making, services tend to be better tailored towards the needs of children and young people, which then leads to better outcomes for these children and young people. And specifically in out of home care, when children and young people have a say and feel like their voice is heard in terms of things like their placement, their care team, their carer, they have a sense of investment in that service or that placement, whatever it is. And I'm sure you would all know that when a young person is invested in their out of home care service, it makes it much easier to do meaningful work. As part of the project that we did with the centre, we looked into barriers and enablers to successful practice in this space. I'm not going to be touching on this part of the project too much today because I think this will be the focus of discussions later on next year or so. And it's all available in much greater detail in our project report that will be available on the open portal later this year. Briefly though, we identified that both barriers and enablers to successful participatory practice originate at different levels: organisational, procedural level and individual level. I should say our project was focused on what organisations can do within their realm of power and responsibility to support participatory practice. And as an aside, I acknowledge that some of the major barriers to successful practice often stem from challenges at levels that you can't affect. So things like funding, accreditation, or contracting. Totally acknowledge those. I'm going to zip over a few of the enablers very quickly. And as I say, there's some stuff on slides that I'm not going to talk to, but you can get later, just so it situates the practice that we will be talking about more. So at the organisational level, cultivating a whole of organisation appreciation for the expertise of children and young people and really valuing what they tell you and what you can learn from them, even by senior leadership, is a really great way to start your participatory practice. We heard from a practitioner that their organisation uses a lived experience group of young people who'd been in out of home care to share their insights with their senior execs, which then inform their policies and procedures. Great work. Positive organisational cultures are moulded and sustained by strong leadership, which hold children's rights as central to the aspects of all out of home care practice. At the procedural level, a major enabler of participatory practice is freeing up time. And I'm sure this is going to be, people will love to hear this or not, but it's essential. I know that's really difficult to do. So there are other things that you can do as well, like reducing the rigid, often arbitrary bureaucracy and compliance requirements, administrative tasks that take up some of your time as workers in this space. Also, utilizing a variety of youth-friendly resources as part of your casework. These are all things that help and enable participatory practice. Finally, at the individual level, when practitioners have the confidence to seek children's opinions in creative ways that meet their individual needs, even on sensitive subjects like contact with family, and when practitioners hold strong cultural competency in supporting the needs of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and families that are culturally and linguistically diverse, these are the bedrock for supporting participatory practice. It really enables strengths and relationship-based practice to take centre stage. And so it's great that Jacinta will be sharing insights later into the importance of relationship and how it supports meaningful decision-making for this group. So that's enough of the barriers and enablers. Before I get into the nitty-gritty of the practices and what we can do, I wanted to also assure you at this point that our findings showed that we do not need to have a massive system overhaul to make a difference. But there are significant ways we can enhance our day-to-day practice that supports children and young people to have a say in the decisions about their lives. So I hope you can hold that and feel better about that. Essentially, our findings showed that there are ways to successfully increase the participatory opportunities for kids in care within the structures of traditional out-of-home care casework practice. Most of these will all be familiar to you. These practices that we're going to talk about, 5 of them today, they're not exhaustive, and I'm sure everyone here has got other creative ways they involve children and young people in decision-making. These are ones that came through in the research strongly and were endorsed by practitioners. So these are meetings, activity tools, youth-friendly documentation, family group conferences or family-led decision-making, and advocates. So again, I'm not going to go through every kind of little enhancement, I'm calling them, to practice that you see on the screen, but they will be available to you later. And don't forget to put your own enhancements in chat. That would be great. So when we say meetings, we looked into the research around all types of meetings. Out-of-home care is heavy with meetings, case plan meetings, education meetings, health meetings, meetings with family, meetings with the residential care staff, whatever it is. When I say meetings, essentially it's when people get together and talk about the young person. So these are things that you can incorporate into your meetings that will enhance children and young people's opportunity to participate. So things like giving the child or young person a choice about how they want to participate. This could be through a representative or through just coming to a portion of the meeting. We heard an example from a practitioner that they have started to ensure that when meetings happen, children and young people are allocated the first slot, because what they'd noticed was that if children and young people went last, some of the key important decision makers who were originally at that meeting had been called off and they weren't there at the end. So just making that small switch allowed children and young people to feel as though they were being heard properly. Consulting with children and young people on the agenda. It gives them decision-making autonomy to decide what's going to be talked about. So some of these things, they're not, they might seem fairly simple, but just slight tweaks really make a difference. That's essentially the essence of this talk today. Moving on to the next practice was activity tools. Now, this came through in the research, and what I mean by activity tools are basically tangible or digital resources designed to explicitly get children and young people to share their voice. So I've popped some examples on the right-hand side. Now, there were lots of examples. These are just a few. Things like yarning cards or conversation cards. We've got the Australian Childhood Foundation Action Toolkit here. That was like play and games and things to elicit feedback. Got the Mind of My Own app, which I think some organisations use here. It's an international app that specifically elicits voice. So some suggestions for including this in your practice could be simply just taking these things to your home visits or in meetings or with family, in family meetings, whatever it might be. The key is that they're interactive, so they require engagement between the child, young person and the practitioner. and they're super child friendly. They're designed to be that way. So conversation cards or yarning cards, for example, they allow a child to direct the conversation, choosing the topics they want to talk about. We heard something in the literature that about children and young people. For them, verbally communicating their views was difficult sometimes for various reasons. So offering them alternative solutions through play or creative methods is really critical. One practitioner also spoke to us about how they engaged a child who was non-verbal at the time, but they were still able to ascertain his wishes on certain things by being attuned to his play. These practitioners said they used social stories to help children with disabilities or developmental delays understand their decision-making options, which was awesome. The next kind of practice that you'll be familiar with is documentation admin, basically. There is a way that you can make this child-friendly, youth-friendly, and it really supports children and young people to gain knowledge about their decision-making opportunities so that they're informed and can be assertive in this space, which is essential to meaningful engagement. Typically, our forms and our admin and our notes and things in out-of-home care can be totally dry and adult-focused. Some have to be, granted, but there are some that can totally be converted into child-friendly versions. Think case plans using pictures or easily digestible language. One practitioner explained that they were focused on starting to use posters, graphics, even QR codes to links to websites and things or apps with information communicating to young people. And they emphasized that all these youth-friendly resources were consciously culturally appropriate and developed and provided information in a range of ways to suit a diversity of children that they work with. Again, you may be doing like all of these things that we say, you may not be, so take what you will from this. This is what came through from the research. We also heard in terms of documentation that some organisations give children and young people welcome packs, whatever they may be, when they enter a service with information that explains their rights and the way that the organisation will seek their views. So for instance, why not create a child-friendly version of your staff code of conduct so that children and young people in the service know exactly what to expect from the practitioners that they work with. The next practice that came through in the research was family group conferences or family-led decision-making for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families. This came through really strongly, a major practice in the international and local literature. But there were certain ways that the information, there was lots of information on how to improve these practices from the children's perspective. So it was a great tool for family voice, but less so for children. So we saw some enhancements here. For instance, ensuring that the child or young person at the height of the meeting was allocated an equal amount of time and power in the conference. We heard that often adult voices were prioritised in these conferences, mainly because they were the loudest and there were more of them there. So it's key that the facilitator or coordinator of family group conferences or family-led decision-making play an advocating role for children in these spaces, and also that they manage adult expectations. The final practice that we talk about in our report and found in the literature was advocates. Now, this might be more familiar to people who've worked outside of Australia. I think it's less of an Australian practice, but I'll talk to that. Independent advocates can be thought of as intermediary people. So they're someone that the child or young person trusts, that they can share their views and their views will be heard. And then they go and talk to the decision makers. They're not decision makers themselves. They go and represent the views. So in places like the UK and Ireland, the practice of involving independent advocates is really common. These people are not part of the care team. In fact, they're not even part of the organisation, but their role is to represent the views of the child. Now, some suggestions of and where this can work in your practice might be to allocate somebody in your casework team who has nothing to do with that child or family to be their advocate. Now, I know that requires resources, but it's just a suggestion. You can also see this with youth workers or residential workers. They're not decision makers, but they can be advocates. Alternatively, you can seek out advocates that may be from the child's extended community, such as religious leaders or culturally significant people like elders or mentors in Aboriginal communities, which was a practice we heard a lot of. Also, practitioners talk to us at length about the ways in which caseworkers and carers were also advocates. So this is an important area to focus on. So they were our they were our 5 practices. I'm going to very quickly just say that we used the Lundy model of child participation to assess these practices. And it's a really great tool for organisations who are interested in adapting or improving their work in this space. It's really simple, 4 concepts, a few questions. It's self-audit, you can do it yourself. I'd highly recommend using this tool for anyone who's interested. So that's going to conclude my portion of this presentation, other than to say I'd like to acknowledge and appreciate the organisations that we consulted with on this project. So that was Berry Street, Melbourne City Mission, AusChild, Anchor, and of course the Centre for Excellence in Child and Family Welfare. I will now hand back over to Pearl, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Lottie. Wow, really refreshing. It's really nice to hear that you don't have to overhaul the system to make a difference. So I'm sure many people appreciate that. We will have time for questions afterwards, so I won't ask you anything now. So moving on to presentation number 2, which is the influence of informal relationships on the lives of young people leaving out-of-home care. So Dr Jacinta Waugh is a teaching fellow and researcher at Monash University's Department of Social Work. Her PhD thesis focused on the influence of informal relationships on young people leaving out-of-home care. Jacinta brings a broad perspective to her social work practice. She has extensive experience in community health, income security, youth homelessness, and child and family support. The development of young people, informal social capital, and their resilience are among her professional interests. Over to you, Jacinta. Oh, are you just on mute?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have I shared my screen? Can people see that?
You have, yep, it's perfect.
Fantastic. So thank you, Pearl, for introducing me. That's a lovely introduction. And thank you, Lottie. That was there's lots of synergy between, I think, our 2 presentations, which is fantastic. I also want to pay my respects and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land in which we are meeting today. Where I am, it's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So today, or for the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to present to you some information on the informal social relationships for care experience to young people. And essentially what I'm going to be doing today is giving a little bit about the background and some key definitions, a little bit about how the research was carried out, but then I'm breaking up the research into 2 major parts. One is that I would really like to give you a practical case demonstration, a little bit of a deep dive into one relationship between a young person and their nominated support person. And I'm bringing together the lenses or the concepts of social support and social capital, which are related but are different, how we bring those together and how they interact together to help a young person be resourced properly or to help meet their needs. And really we're looking at their developmental needs and their environmental needs. And the second part of the presentation, I really want to talk to you about the specialist worker view and what they actually say in the way of barriers and facilitators for informal social supports for young people. And also I want to talk to you about some of the things that they've actually said, some of the things that they do to encourage positive informal social relationships for young people. So the background to the study is essentially, when I was looking at the literature, and this may be very, common knowledge, is that when we're looking at young people's transitions from coming out of care and into adulthood, often they've got a number of things, several things that they need to be dealing with, and it's usually that they're dealing with them at once, simultaneously, and often with sort of just minimal support. And so the literature says that that's a very compressed and accelerated transition. And a term that's being used is instant adulthood for young people. So one of the things that I was thinking about, well, what is it about social relationships that could actually help slow that transition down or make it more gradual? Time is a resource, and I noted that time came up a few times on Lottie's presentation as well, that relationships, particularly meaningful relationships, do take a little bit of time, take times to grow. So I'm doing this through those lenses of social support and social capital, which I'll give definitions about in a minute. And also I would argue that our policy and practice is embedded in these things about social support and social capital. I think we do it all. We, as practitioners, this is and doing that relational work as much as we possibly can is in the bureaucracies that we live in and work in, I should say. It can be sort of hard work, but in fact, that's our bread and butter. That's the sort of stuff that we do. And I just want to say, when it comes to the empirical research, probably not surprising to people at all, that the informal support for care experienced young people is quite varied. And of course, when I was speaking to practitioners, that also was, it confirmed the empirical literature. So no surprise there. So when we're actually looking at the key definitions I'm really wanting to give you some key definitions of social capital and social support at this point in time. So social capital, it can be both negative and positive, but social capital is essentially referring to the resources a person gains through other people in their network. And social support is the actual or perceived assistance provided by others. And in this research, I'm looking at those positive support actions that a nominated person who is nominated by the young person, I'm looking at their supportive actions of how they have actually assisted that young person to get some of their help them get their some of their fundamental needs met. So how did I carry it out? Well, it is sort of steeped in qualitative, really sort of talking and interviewing people. So it's very, very much looking at the meaning of words. And it is exploratory research, it's something, putting those two lenses together. There hasn't been much work on that, and I'll be showing you the framework in a minute about how I did that. But what I did is that I interviewed 8 young people, and I talked to them about what they thought, social support, what did positive support look like to them. Was there someone in their life that was important to them, that has given them a lot of good support? And, they were able to name at least one person. And then we talked about that relationship a little bit. And then I asked that young person, of course, if permitted to do so, would it be okay for me to interview the nominated support person? So in the end, I got 8 young people and 6 of their nominated support people were interviewed. And then to augment this and to contextualise this information, I also interviewed specialist workers who are, a range of people who worked in residential care, who worked in foster care programs, who worked in continuing care programs. Mainly they were people that were working at the coalface, they were caseworkers, but I also interviewed team leaders, a couple of team leaders, a couple of program managers, and one executive level manager. And it wasn't the data wasn't matching with these people. It was me seeking a wider view from the specialist people. So essentially what I did is, through looking at the literature, I developed an analytical conceptual framework. And essentially what I did is thought, well, this is the individual in the network of this young person. What sort of social support do they give them, and how is this facilitated through? And it's these social capital functions that facilitate a lot of the really good practical, emotional, esteem, appraisal, and informational and companion support. And often with the social capital functions, we know workers would sort of understand bonding and bridging and linking. I actually give definitions later on, but what I'm really interested in showing you today is how some of this implicit, some of the social capital can be invisible because it happens so quickly in a relationship that we don't quite notice it. And so the good thing about this analytical framework is that it makes the implicit, or sometimes the invisible things happening, more explicit. So we can get a deeper knowledge of what's actually going on in the relationship. And it's some of that stuff that I want to actually show you today. So essentially, when you have these interactions of social support and social capital, some of these needs get met, their developmental needs and their environmental needs. And my hypothesis is that it helps for the young person's transition to slow down a bit, or parts of their transition to slow down a bit. So what I want to do is actually just do a very a deep dive into one of the young participants that I talked to, and that their support person, and it's John and Amy. Now, at the time, John was 20. He was living in a supported accommodation. He was unemployed and was planning to study. He had been in care since he was very, very young, and he had a very mixed care experience, and he had both residential care and foster care placements. Had known Amy since he was 6, and Amy had been his respite carer, and he'd been going to Amy at least once a month. And their during when her circumstances changed, Amy got married and she had kids of her own, and John saw all of this as well. And the relationship has continued since he's actually, he's left care. They keep in contact through social media, texting and seeing each other, and they both see each other as family. So this is a really good example, because some of my other examples show more social capital, some actually show less social capital. This example actually shows that even though that Amy and John don't see each other on a daily basis, there's enough support and social capital going on that actually has helped John. And one of I want to get on to how it actually has. So absolutely, you don't need to read all these quotes. This is going to be like what Lottie said. This is stuff that you can, if you're interested, you can look at afterwards. But sort of got the slides this way, so you sort of know how I did this analysis. And then I've actually, the titles of these next 4 slides are essentially the themes that are actually coming from this research. And it's probably information, a lot of it it may seem quite familiar to you, some of it may not. When we think of social capital, often we think of its utility. And what was really good about this research is that it really showed me, when I looked really closely, was the meaningful relationships. Now, it may be, it was a bit of an insight, but it may be a bit obvious. But of course, reciprocity, that idea of actually receiving and returning and giving back, helps the relationship become meaningful. And this is what actually happened over time. So this lovely quote of Amy saying, you know, John, you know, yes, we've known each other for a while, we've seen my kids grow up, he acts like an uncle to them, is a really lovely way for John to see that absolutely the relationship has been bridged over, that Amy has actually bridged her children to John. There's a trust growing in the relationship, and John is able to possibly see that he's really good with kids. There's a positive identity, and it's enriched his social relationships. So the next one I want to say, and this is where the more implicit social capital is really interesting, which is the one of the informational channel. So essentially, when it comes to linking, absolutely what Amy has done has shown John, or has linked John, to an organisation that's a fairly powerful organisation that's able to give him his identity document. But what she also does is gives him the information about how to go about getting that document. So that's the more implicit informational channel at work. And for me, I'm trying to say that's actually really important for us to know that, because it's sort of a little bit more invisible, and it's good to know that it's not that overtly the overt linking capital working here. It's also the more implicit informational channel by role modelling or giving John that information. So there's information support. And essentially what I'm saying, the met need is a specific self-care or independent living skill that John is learning. And also I would consider it to be a normative social experience. It's something that adults of their children, or parents of their children, or other adults naturally do with their children in showing them certain things to help them learn independence. The next one that I want to talk about is an internal developmental resource, which is to do with emotional support and esteem support. So Amy has actually given John, as John has actually said, she's been there for him. It's been a bumpy road for him, but she's actually seen him through up and down. And so she's actually given him emotional support. But the other thing that I find really interesting is that young people, what I noted is that they were able to name emotional support, and every one of the young people that I interviewed named some form of emotional support from their nominated support person. What was actually more implicit was the esteem support. The nominated support person held these young people in high regard, in really sort of good, positive regard. And you could tell that they did that because there was so much support that they were giving them. And I would say that they wouldn't have been nominated if the young person actually didn't feel that they were worthy. That was actually quite palpable when I was actually doing this research. So esteem support, it's not really named by the young person. It's a more of an abstract concept, but it was certainly there. And I just sort of gave the example here through John actually saying, you know, I know that Amy's actually, you know, not my mum, but she is like my mum. You know, she's been there for me and their family. So that's actually, again, meeting the need for a social relationship, and also a possession of or construction of self-worth, because it's giving him some sort of family type identity with Amy. And the last one I want to talk about, and I know my time is nearly up, is this concept of progressive responsibility. Essentially, it's interesting, it's, you know, part of the support, particularly of adult support, and I saw this with the young people that did have adult supports, that sometimes, you know, as part of that is that sometimes the young person have to be, they're supported, but they're also challenged a little bit with some of their ideas. So this is actually Amy talking about John, saying, you know, sometimes he avoids conflict and sometimes that's not always the way to go. So she talks to him about that. She has a conversation about that. For this to happen, there needs to be trust. There needs to be good bonding capital. But what she's doing is talking about the social norms about expected behaviour, and that conversation that she has with him in that really sort of skilled way is sort of, you know, talking about his behaviour in a way that's going to be helpful for him. And it's also, I would argue that that's actually interacting with what we call informational or appraisal support. So it's actually giving a young person constructive feedback on achievements or how they behave in a certain situation. So what John is learning is some emotional and behavioural development and the way that he presents himself to the world. So I would say with progressive responsibility, and this is this time factor, you know, time is a resource. This happens over time. And I would argue that this is not the stuff of an accelerated and compressed transition. It's the opposite of that. It's an element of a gradual transition. And this is what we want, I would argue, for young people. So I'm just going to very quickly talk about the workers' perspectives. So absolutely, the variability of informal relationships, you confirmed the literature. These were the sorts of things that you were saying, and the impact of insufficient positive informal relationships are things like extreme loneliness. You know, some people said they may miss out on the opportunity to be loved. It's this absence of relational support. Of course, some workers actually said, well, it can actually, the impact can lead to homelessness, and it can lead to young people maybe being involved in the justice system, and it can lead to unemployment. But it was also what's really I found interesting was all these things, all these lovely, so what we need in the way of informal social relationships, they just don't have the same experience as other young people. The impact also on harmful relationships, the two main things that workers talked about was sometimes they can be associating with people who are more needy than what they are, and it can cause trouble. And also they can be associating with people who possibly don't have their best interests at heart either. So but they saw beneficial relationships, and this is what they saw when good relationships were happening: the opportunity to give back, being bridged to other people, families, and, you know, sometimes if the young person remains at school, they can actually have a feeling of achieving and being part of a wider opportunity. So the workers talked about trauma being a barrier, stigma, shame and embarrassment, the unpredictability of placements generally, institutionalised care, and the structural barriers of frequent placements, moving around a lot, the deficiency in guaranteed housing, which is another structural barrier, and the lack of funding for social activities. But they also talked about what facilitated the creation, or how informal relationships can be helped along. You know, some people, the relationships, when they do have them when they're a little bit older, somewhat compensate for the trauma. Workers, this is just for another presentation, the workers and what they can do in their work is fantastic. They absolutely use the social resources of social capital and social support, predictability, of course, normative experiences rather than institutionalized care, and of course continuing care. A lot of work is actually said is helpful for the relationships. So essentially, my last slide is what tips do workers give. They talked about ensuring that their young clients associate with people who have a healthy influence, and they do a little bit of work. They do talk to young people about that. They also talk about trying to find out, or getting the funding, or trying to find a way to help young people to participate with their interests, be it sport, be it cultural, be it drama, whatever it is, trying to find a way to do that so they expand their social networks. Advocacy, I had one really good example of a worker trying, when a young person was willing and ready to go back to school, she really advocated hard to get that young person back at school, saying to the teachers, he may not be there all the time, but he really needs this. He needs this, and he's willing to do this now. And then she saw him in a group of friends, sort of new people. So there was this sort of little win for her when she actually saw that, and she was quite, she thought it was a really sort of good thing to see. And the old-fashioned, very much the social work tool of eco-mapping, and sitting down very respectfully with young people and talking to them, doing it well in a very compassionate way about who is in their network, and being really curious about the relationships that they have with other people, the strength of it, how often they see them, and doing that sort of work with young people as well. So I'm going to say that my clarion call for the end of this is we can't rely on luck. I agree with Mike Steen, who's a researcher in Britain, that for many people, changing the odds must go hand in hand with overcoming the odds. And so therefore, what we need to be doing is increasing positive informal relationships to have elevated and equal importance with the other domains in the pathway plan to leave care and the transition to adulthood. So thank you very much for everyone for listening.
Thank you, Jacinta. Wonderful presentation. Really, really interesting to think about social capital, and something that I think could do with a lot more energy going forward. So thank you so much. We will have time for some questions. Thank you so much for everyone that's popped a few in the chat already. I will address them shortly. But as many of you are working in the sector, we know that you've got your own learnings, and we're really keen to hear your expertise and experience in building young people's engagement, their strong relationships within and outside their care experience, and how you support the decision making. So please continue to share your own examples. We've got some friends in the audience. So to get the ball rolling, we've asked a couple of our sector stakeholders to share their thoughts and reflect on what they see as important elements to consider. So we do have Heidi Tucker, who is the CEO of Anchor Community Care. Welcome, Heidi. And we also have Tegan Nichols, who's a youth mentor at Anchor. So Tegan has a care experience and was supported by the Anchor team to transition from care into independence. And now Tegan works with Anchor as a youth mentor to support other young people transitioning from care. So I've got a question for you both. Heidi, we'll start off with you. Anchor provide a number of programs and services to children and young people in care and in their transition out of care. We know that supporting participation and decision-making for young people in care can be difficult, as we've heard. There can be some barriers, but when it's done well, has powerful outcomes. So I'm keen to hear your insights on this.
Okay, so some reflections that I have about this is Anchor and a number of its programs are underpinned by advantage thinking. And one of the things about advantage thinking is that you create an environment for young people where you have higher aspirations for them than, maybe what they've experienced before. And I feel quite strongly that by having higher aspirations from the workers does rub off on young people, and young people then do raise up their sort of expectations or their aspirations for themselves. But I guess that, if you are talking to a young person and you have raised aspirations for them, you will actually have respectful conversations. And I think this is what happens sometimes, is that people's very low expectations and aspirations for young people in care can lead to the potential of not disrespectful, but sometimes unhelpful kind of relationships and conversations. Tegan and I caught up before, we came on screen for a while this morning, and, the other thing very much is around consistency. I think you've got to be consistent. You've got to keep going. I think the other thing that has always struck me about kids in care in comparison to our own children, I've had children, probably a lot of people have around the screen, is the higher expectations we have from them for participation in decision making. And, often I've reflected that, you've got kids, often kids coming along to school meetings and things, and, the number of times that our kids in care have to front the assistant principal or the principal, you need to come to this meeting, you need to tell them what you want, whatever. Well, I think we might have one or two times in our experiences with kids about how many times I actually had to speak to the assistant principal. So I actually think that in the absence of, the parent champion, if you like, our kids and young people in care we really expect a lot of them. Tegan and I were also talking about, the fact that a lot of our work is done in compression, so without the time. And we're just like, come on, we've just got to get on with these cases, got to get on with this, in front of the magistrate, or, whatever it is we're doing. And so it's just way too quick, way too quick for kids and young people. And the other thing that I think that really shines out to me, and I know Tegan will talk a bit more about this, is that actually they don't get choices, meaningful choices. So they don't get, like, do you want to do this or do you want to do that? And often it's just asked once, do you want to do this or do you want to do that? And it's like, how many people's kids around the screen change their mind every week about whether they're going to play basketball or netball or whatever. And so we almost give them one chance, this or this. And then it often comes back with, oh, well, I asked them if they wanted to do this or that, and they didn't really know. And I think that's also really, really difficult. What actual choices are we giving young people in care, I would ask. And often it's not choices at all. And I think that we couch it in choices because it maybe makes us feel a bit better. But in fact, often children and young people, they actually want to know the truth. They actually want to know more. And they want the truth. They don't want you, fluffing it up, sort of thing, as such. So those would be my main reflections: consistency, lifting aspirations of children and young people that come into care, which then leads to more respectful conversations. I totally agree with the presenters. Jacinta's presentation really resonates with me because it's very much the theory of change that we had about Brighter Futures, which was that young people would do better if they had people spending time with them that are not paid to, and that people have the same interests and things, and took notice of them, which then, potentially led to young people, and Tegan and I once again talked about this before, is what people don't understand is that we other these kids and young people in care. We make them feel like they're others, they're different. And, you know, I have heard from adults who, you know, in care that say, you know, I felt so different to everybody else. I was so different. And, you know, in one extreme was this young woman said to me once that she walks on the other side of the street when she sees people coming because she thinks she looks so different, when she just didn't at all. But this is what we do. We make them other. So just the system. It's not anyone's fault. The system is another.
Thanks, Heidi. Well said, and couldn't, you know, particularly the part about aspirations, that's very important to our program, raising expectations. But Tegan, it would be fabulous to hear from you. So would you mind sharing your experiences of while you're in care and how you were supported to make decisions and participate in decisions that affected you?
Younger in the Resi, growing up in Resi, I didn't really understand anything, so I was very vulnerable, and like people made decisions for me, so I didn't get like my own say in a way. But like as time has gone on, I've grown up. I've realized a lot more things, and going into another program, Anchor, has been like really helpful because they've like worked around it differently, so they've helped me out understand a lot more now as well, and also have my own say. I get to choose, but like freedom, I guess.
When Tegan and I were talking earlier, we were talking about the two experiences she had that she can remember well. One was when she had to go to Resi Care and she got told nothing. She didn't know what Resi Care was. She'd never heard of it. Her friends had never heard of it. She moved in with strangers, and she had no say in the decision. And then the next time she changed where she lived, it was a bit different. Do you want to sort of maybe reflect on that, Tegan, about the experience of going into Resi Care and then the experience of coming here with Anchor?
Yeah. So Resi, I had no knowledge. I was going into residential care as like not knowing what it was. So it still surprises me to this day how like many kids don't know about Resi, because even when I was a kid, I didn't know anything of it. The majority of like only Resi, you kind of feel singled out in Resi. We're coming like this program, they've worked around it differently, so they introduced you like I'm stuck.
No, that's right. We talked a little bit earlier about how decision making needs practice. I'm 62 and I'm still practicing good decision.
Yeah, me too. Absolutely. Yeah.
How until you came here to Anchor, you had no practice, no experience, had you, of making decisions?
Yeah, I'm still learning. Obviously, this is a new thing for me too. Like speaking, it's new. Everything's new, so I'm still learning and practicing.
Oh, we all are, Tegan. Don't worry, I am too. This is it's sometimes a bit nerve-wracking speaking publicly, but if you have some closing comments about how you support young people now in your role as a mentor to make decisions, that would be lovely.
I just like to treat them like I'm the big sister, kind of, not too like there for the right reasons, like to have a good, just a conversation and then lean them towards like the right things and whatnot, but I'm not like too pushy or something. Like I just an ear to listen, because growing up like in Resi, I didn't have people that like had the similar experiences, and like the people that I work with here, it just makes me feel a bit more comfortable knowing that they can like kind of relate to someone because they're going through the same situation. So yeah, just an ear to listen and a shoulder to cry on, maybe.
That's fantastic. Tegan, you're doing great work. Really appreciate you sharing your experiences, and thank you, Heidi, as well. That's some really good comments there about raising expectations and aspirations in particular. Mark, I'll quickly throw to you. So Mark Rayner, you're from Wombat Housing. Your team supports young people to access independent housing post-care, which is obviously a really critical element of this picture. So what are your insights on the impact of young people when there's a lack of informal relationships at that stage of their life?
Yeah, thanks for asking the question. We've been supporting people for about 20 years in post-care in various sort of housing options for young people needing care. I guess when young people are lacking these connections, you can see that they're coming into a really difficult stage of their life without some of the grounding that you would probably need to be successful. And so I guess we're experiencing, similar to what's just been spoken about, lots of young people who really aren't equipped to make decisions that they're asked to make. And I sort of reflected a little bit on my work when I was doing casework, and I would take young people to the supermarket and stand in front of the laundry detergent aisle, and they would be absolutely totally overwhelmed. And I'd say, which one are you going to pick? And they'd just reach out and grab one and go, why'd you pick that one? And they'd look at me like I was crazy. And, we'd have a conversation around that. And I think, being in care, there were so many opportunities for them to be involved in some of those little decisions along the way that would help them, get better at making, some of the larger decisions that they're forced to make, probably too early. And I guess, from our perspective, we try and put young people in positions where they do have to make some of these little decisions and talk through those decisions and ask how they made them and, reflect on them and, provide some of that guidance. I think, some of that social and relationship guidance that they need. And so we spend a lot of time around that sort of, I guess less tangible support, because that's probably the work that they've missed out on, because they don't have that, adult figure that they can rely on to ask these questions. And some do to some extent, and some have, some positive and negative experiences with those figures. And sometimes we're helping negotiate them, because some of those figures can be really loving and supportive, but also dangerous. And so it's about trying to, work through that in a sort of safe way. And we also try and model the consistency, I guess, that they require, and demonstrate that they are worthy of having these relationships, and try and facilitate the ability to develop them, within the community as well.
Thanks, Mark. That's really important. And I'm sorry we don't have more time to keep chatting here, but I'd love to get to some of the audience questions. So really appreciate you chiming in there. So some fabulous questions in the chat. It's hard to pick one, but I'm going to go from the bottom and move my way up. So we've got a question here from Lani. So I'll just read it out. So informative and interesting. I'm wondering if either speakers feel a peer mentoring program, so a young person in care or who have had experience with care, paired with a mentor who is also care experienced, so not a professional, would be an effective intervention tool to address or prepare them better for transitioning out of care. So Lottie and Jacinta, I'm keen to hear your thoughts on what peer mentoring might add as a value.
Jacinta, do you want to take the bulk of that one?
Yeah, no, not a problem. I think there's lots of good stuff to be said about peer mentoring. I think the research actually says that it can be really helpful, and I think it's what Tegan was actually saying. If she the sort of stuff that she does in sort of just being that listening ear and trying to lead people to really sort of good decisions, but not being too pushy, and being really respectful of people making, wanting to make their own decisions, and just respectful of them. I think peer mentoring can be really helpful. And the other thing is, when you've got a care experienced young person, is that that lived experience, they actually know, I mean, they know it. And they may be able to understand it or have a deeper understanding of certain things that people who don't have the care experience. But what I would argue, so I do think peer mentoring is probably one tool, and I think it's amongst also really good adult support as well, that needs to be there. But absolutely, for me, peer mentoring is not such a bad thing. And I like the informality of it, particularly if you do some informal stuff, because it can be a little bit more sustainable. Some of the research says about formal peer mentoring sometimes may not be helpful because it can stop suddenly, and that can sometimes not be very good for the young person, because the person that they were trusting and had in their life suddenly is not there anymore. So if things can happen more naturally, I know that relationships are fragile and they can be up and down, but sometimes I think that sort of those natural frames of social capital with informal peer mentoring is not such a bad thing.
Thanks, Jacinta. Lottie, I have a question here for you. So, Lottie, I wonder whether, Lottie, you consulted with any young people in care in your research. I'd be interested to know whether their experiences were also reflected in the research.
Great question. And part of the scope of this project was unfortunately that we didn't speak to children and young people. Of course, that's a limitation. It's by virtue of it being a short project, and the value of speaking to children and young people is, no one can argue that. I guess we focused on practitioners because they really hold the system in their hands. Young people don't get a choice, as Heidi said. It's the practitioners that actually offer them choices. So if practitioners are often doing that big work, I mean, it's not how the system should be, but it is how it is. So we spoke to practitioners for that reason, to see what can they be doing to support this meaningful work. Of course, if we had more time and scaled up this project, totally would go and speak to children and young people. The experiences there is quite a bit of research out there, though. So we didn't do it, but we looked at the research around what children and young people value. And that was part of our evaluation of whether these practices were working or not. What were the impacts and outcomes that children and young people reported? Unfortunately, a lot of the research says that they still accept care without feeling like they were heard. And I think that's kind of partially what we heard from Tegan. Thankfully, she did have opportunities to be heard. But yeah, great question. And I know it's a flaw in the research or in the project that we did, but totally worth exploring more. Thanks, Pearl.
Thanks, Lottie. It's definitely a space that we all need to continue to work on, and this is why webinars like this are so important. Everyone's learning and finding their way. So thank you all so much. Lots of questions and not much time, so I apologise for my poor timekeeping there. We know that this is just the beginning of these conversations to innovate and improve practices for children in care. So I really appreciate particularly Jacinta and Lottie for presenting today.